Assalamu alaikum and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail. I'm an attorney, a lecturer, and a public debater based in South Africa. And today we've got a special guest all the way from Washington, D.C. in the United States of America. None other than Imam Muhammad Al Asi, an imam who formerly led the Salah at the Islamic Center of Washington and teaches works on Quranic exegesis. In fact, as has been claimed, one of the first Quranic translations of tafsirs said to have been written originally in English. Imam Al Asi was elected as the Imam of the Masjid in 1981. In March 1983, Imam Al Asi was expelled from the center for preaching views that were deemed as antithetical to the Saudi establishment. And although he still identifies himself as the Imam of the Islamic Center, the center allegedly states that it has no more affiliation with him. And up to this day, in 2022, as I understand, he still holds Jummah khutbahs every Friday on the sidewalk of the Islamic Center. He's been with the Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought and has contributed to Crescent International over the years. I am the proud owner of a phenomenal work that has been produced by him, the Ascendant Qur'an. He has done a 14-volume tafsir on this. This is a far more newer edition, an advanced English translation of the meaning of the Qur'an, translation directly by him. And certainly the translation is extremely phenomenal. And I've got none other than Imam Al Asi on the other side, joining us from Washington, D.C. Assalamu alaikum, Imam, and welcome to the airwaves and the platforms of South Africa.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's an honor to be with South African brothers, as I've been there quite a few times personally, but nevertheless, this is also an opportunity to share whatever Q's and A's we're gonna bounce around, inshallah, in the coming hour.
Inshallah. Let me start off with this because certainly I was extremely impressed. You know, I haven't got the entire set of the 14-volume tafsir that you commenced, I believe, in 2009. I don't know if it's gone up to 15. But I came across this last year in the latter part of 2019, and I went through the quite a significant portion of the translation. And we're gonna delve into some of the issues here, and I found it phenomenally unique in many instances, in contrast to many of the existing translations out there. One of the aspects that you seem to emphasize is that you've emphasized certain elements within your work. Firstly, that by writing in English, which is obviously the lingua franca in the Muslim world, the precise meaning of the Quranic verses can be conveyed in that language. And secondly, one of the things which you've also highlighted is the fact that there are aspects within your tafsir and indeed your translation which are missing in other translations. You know, things like, for example, power. You always, I see this focus on the authority of Allah, on the power of Allah. You know, you've described your tafsir as realigning man with the divine power authority. What was your motivation in coming up with this, you know, what I would basically view as your magnum opus?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it goes to the heart of the matter. And that is that, you see, for a person to answer that your question very satisfactorily, at least for me, to give it a very in-depth answer, we'd have to go into the Arabic language. Obviously, this is not going to be possible as we don't have an Arabic medium or an Arabic audience tuned in. So we're left with the English language. So here I'm going to attempt to answer your question to the best that I can in the English language.
Yes.
The Arabic language itself has suffered through the process of 14 centuries. Since the revelation of the Qur'an in the Arabic language. It has suffered mainly from two sources. One of them is the inability of those who were becoming, I'm talking about 14 centuries now. I'm not talking about a few days or one generation. I'm talking, you have to keep this in mind. I'm talking about 14 centuries when many peoples of different linguistic backgrounds became Muslims themselves. Upon becoming Muslims, obviously, there is a drive in Muslims to understand the Qur'an itself. So they began learning the language of the Qur'an. Some of them became Arabic speakers. If you look at the geography of the world, the Arabian Peninsula was the only, and a few areas around it, limited areas, were the only Arabic-speaking geographical areas in the whole world. So when the non-Arabic speakers around the Arabian Peninsula, northwards, eastwards, and westwards, as well as to the south, west, they gained the Arabic language. It wasn't their original language. So this process diluted in an innocent way. You have to understand this very accurately. It diluted the depth of the Arabic language. In other words, we have key words in the Qur'an, Arabic words. Obviously, the Qur'an is an Arabic scripture. So we have key words that have lost their original meaning. Or, in the best of circumstances, the original meanings have been either diluted or they deviated. That's one element that went into losing the understanding of the meanings of the Qur'an within the authoritative and power structure parameters of the Qur'an. The other, and this is not the innocent part, this is a malicious attempt to sort of destroy the Arabic language. And this began when colonialism, basically European powers, set foot in Islamic countries. This probably began about, it began in the clashes between the Muslims and Europe with the Crusades, and then with Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. And then after that, we have the history of the Ottoman Sultanate and its clashes. So there was this gradual recession of Islamic power coupled with the gradual advancement of anti-Islamic powers. These not only colonized Muslim peoples and countries militarily, they also colonized them culturally and mentally. And in this reached its peak in the 20th, and we're using the Gregorian calendar here, in the 20th century, when the British and the French were brutal in their colonialism of North Africa and Algeria in particular. And the British were concentrating their colonialist objectives inside Egypt. Both of these, as far as the Qur'an and the Arabic language is concerned, both of these had as their ultimate objective the destruction of the Arabic language. And they went about this in different ways.
Are you saying through translation? Because as I understand it then, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but are you saying, you're talking about particularly an Orientalist project on the Quran? Because in your preface, you, for example, argue that the translations that are available in the English language are, with very few exceptions, either archaic or redundant. There's an absence of the lucid and judicious contents of the ayats, coherent and realistic subject matters. Are you saying that most of the modern, even Muslim English translators have somehow or the other internalized the Orientalist project in its attempt to translate the Quran, and in doing so, destroyed the actual essence and meaning of the text. Is that my understanding in terms of where you're heading?
Well, it depends on who we're talking about as a translator. There are some translators who, let us say, subconsciously did not do the Quranic translation justice, just because they themselves either tried to promote Judeo-Christian vocabulary to match the meanings of the Quran, or they tried, and as I said, it depends on translator, or the translator tried to promote the Arabic word that he's translated to fit the Judeo-Christian definition of a certain word. That's why when you take the mainstream translations that are out there and you compare them with the translation that I worked on, the Ascendant Qur'an, you will find that I have sanitized the translation from being subject to Judeo-Christian terms. Because in the Judeo-Christian world, and this applies to Christians more than it applies to Jews, what they have done with their religious vocabulary, they have secularized. They not only secularized their governments, they also secularized their religion.
Scripture, yeah.
And their scripture. So this process of them having one vocabulary for religious speeches and another vocabulary for political speeches, this same approach, not in a very thought out manner, but it's an infection. It was a cultural, a linguistic, and a educational pathogen that worked its way into the Muslim realm and settled even in the minds of the most sincere of translators.
So I'll give you, if you know, I don't want to move your thought away, but if you would talk about specific examples, I don't want to go to Muhammad Asad, but the two examples that come to mind about having this linguistic pattern, Abdullah Yusuf Ali and Marmaduke Picketall. I mean, in terms of the popular translations that existed in the English-speaking Muslim world, would they be examples of this social conditioning that somehow or the other internalized their approach in translating the Quranic text?
Well, I'll give you a very short answer to that. They would be a perfect example of those who I don't for one instance impugn their sincerity. They were very sincere in trying to relay the original Arabic ayat into the English language. But with the shortcoming of them subjecting these meanings of the Quran to the biblical vocabulary. And this is where the Quran becomes biblicized in its translation. In the effort, I say this with a degree of humbleness, I tried my best to avoid falling into that trap. And that's why a close reader who would take the time out to compare the translation that I worked on with the translation of the two characters of the two, may Allah, rest them in eternal peace, Mr. Marmaduke and Yusuf Ali, you will find that I avoided altogether the wording that has become a deactivation of the message of the Quran, which is the message of all scriptures of all time and the message of all prophets of all time. So we're talking about a historical message here that has been stifled just by the choice of words.
The contrary position could be made, because particularly within the conservatives, in the Muslim-speaking world, more particularly in modern times. Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation has been unfortunately attacked and pilloried by, for example, people within the Saudi establishment. If you recall, I believe in the early 80s, there was a sanitized edition that was produced of Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, reducing all his footnotes, essentially bastardizing the text. And eventually that was replaced by a translation which was viewed as somehow the other moving in the complete opposite direction and kind of, in a way similar to the direction that you are particularly proposing, but something which essentially reduced the text to a literalistic atomism, the Hilali Khan translation, which in my view is probably one of the worst translations in the Muslim world, and indeed the world today. The Khan Hilali translation, which is now being banged out throughout the world by the Saudi establishment in mosques in parts of the United States and so on. Was that not a kind of a reactionary measure to what Yusuf Ali produced and what some of the earlier, what you call them, sincere Muslim translators did? And you've got this kind of monstrosity that replaced what was there. That was a downside.
Well, a good thing that you bring this up, because it has a background to it, and it proves the destruction and the havoc that has been played by the Saudi decision makers when it comes not only to the translation of the Qur'an, but to Islam as a whole. Whether it concerns the Hajj and the Umrah, or whether it concerns working the plans of the CIA and imperialism in different Muslim countries. But the most destructive, and I think the Saudi establishment is, as we speak, is self-destructing. It's because its whole religious class that it relied upon, because in the origination of the Saudi nation state, there was a gentleman's agreement between the religious class of the Sheikh family and the political class of the Saud family. They entered into this gentleman's agreement that they would work hand in hand. They kept this up until the advent of Muhammad ibn Salman, MBS. And so in the last 40 years or so, the Saudis have worked, the Saudi establishment had worked hand in glove with its religious components. And those religious components that are referred to in many publications and in many discourses as the Wahhabis or the Salafis, and then to refine it even more, the Neo-Wahhabis and the Neo-Salafis. These were working with a tremendous budget during the course of 40 solid years. They were financing Islamic institutions all around the world. They were financing educational systems. They had set up an arrangement with members of Islamic movements in different Muslim countries. And they put this in full gear. Within this schemata, there was this process of presenting Islamic literature in the form of books that they would send out to the four corners of the earth and distribute them freely and without charge. And much of this was later on targeted against Islamic revival. It began with targeting the Islamic revolution in Iran, but then, as we see in the past several years, it took on the Islamic movements that the Saudi establishment was financing in the 40 years, and it turned against them. And it went even further, and it turned against its own Wahhabi Salafi scholars, many of them languishing behind bars as we speak, and now for years. So we go back to the central point here, and that is their monkey business, as it were, when it comes to the translation of the Qur'an. And they did change some words. There was a committee that was set up that was responsible for what they say adjusting. This is their wording, adjusting Yusuf Ali's translation. Now, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would calculate things, on one of my first journeys to South Africa, Marhoom Abdullah Didat, he had mentioned to me the fact that Abdullah Yusuf Ali was an Indian Shi'i Muslim, which at that time I did not know. This was a few decades ago. And that rang a bell in my mind. Early on, I was not working on translation or tafsir of the Qur'an. But that remark stayed in my mind. And then later on, I came to know, and I can't reveal sources here, but I came to know that there was a committee that was supervised by the late Dr. Marhoom Ismail Al-Faruqi that took on this task of quote unquote sanitizing the translation of Abdullah Yusuf Ali. For a researcher, it would be very, very interesting to obtain the first editions of Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation. I think they came out probably in the maybe... It
was 1934, 1938. I've got the original with me, by the way, and I can see the marked difference between the 38 edition, which was done, and in fact, the Islamic Propagation Center under the late Sheikh Didat reproduced the 1934, 38 edition. But the Amana Publications Trust in the United States, and I think the North American Islamic Trust, which was then, I think, backed or sponsored by the Saudis, they removed a significant number of footnotes from Yusuf Ali's translation, a lot of his comments on Zulqarnain, Alexander the Great, some of the appendixes that he had, and they essentially sanitized a lot of his ideas and views in many instances.
Very good. So that's an excellent contribution, and I, in a very innocent way, I envy you that you do have that original translation. I'm still looking for it myself. If you can hold on to a copy,
I would be more than willing to send you a copy of that, inshallah. But I want to ask you this, without detracting. I mean, I mentioned, the Hilali Khan translation is embarrassing because, number one, it is a go-to source by people in your country like Robert Spencer and some of these Islamophobes. But what was the appeal in the English that the Saudis kind of fell in love with the Hilali? I don't know who these people are. Taqiyuddin al-Hilali and Dr. Muhammad Mohsin kind of appear to be sincere people. But I mean, as a Quranic translator and mufassir yourself, what would you say, from your expert opinion, would be problematic with that specific translation? Is it the parenthesis, the literalism, the fact that they are facetious? For example, in certain instances, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, as opposed to the conventional, this is a book, they would, the emphasis on the literalistic, that is a book. I mean, but these kind of nuances and literalism, is that what is the downside of this particular translation? What's your take on that?
Well, I have to tell you, in the process of preparing my translation, I obtained 20 to 30 other translations. Among those, none of them, this Hilali translation, I have not gotten I don't have it. So I can't comment on it simply because I'm not versed on it. I don't have it in my possession, even though I did my utmost to collect as many translations as I could. So I can't comment on that particular translation. But out of the 25 or 28 different translations that I have, the 5 that I referred to as me identifying their value was Muhammad Asad, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Sahih International, Marmaduke Pictal, and another one. It doesn't come to my mind at this time.
I think was it not Abdul Majid Daryabadi, the Daryabadi translation? I think
it wasn't that one. It was a translation done by, and I rarely went to it, but I refer to it sometimes because I found some of it was done maybe a couple of 100 years ago, one of the very early translations. And the copy that I got was very old. It was falling apart. But later on, I realized that someone somewhere had reprinted it. And I obtained that reprint later on, but somewhat Pierce or something like that. But anyways, these are the ones that I referred to. And they have, and all of them are polluted, right? Except for Muhammad Asad. I have, and I acknowledge that in my introductory remarks, that he is the one. I think I have many disagreements with him. May Allah rest his soul in peace. But it's obvious if you understand the Arabic language and you understand the English language, both of them on par with each other. You will understand that he gave it an effort to give a rational meaning to the ayat of the Qur'an. Because many of us, when we want to read the Qur'an, and the Qur'an has many advantages to it. Even when you read it, when you don't understand it, there is this psychological and emotional input that a person gets from reading the Qur'an. But it means, the Qur'an means to address, in addition to our emotional self, our rational self. And Muhammad Asad came at the right time because, right now we live in an intelligent, intellectual, thinking atmosphere. The world is not in dark ages. It is at a time when people are beginning to open up their minds and reason. What is this saying? What is whether it's the Quran or any other scripture or any other book? What is this book saying to me? So we don't want to begin reading these ayat and then I have a fuzzy idea, and there are ayat in the Quran that cannot be thoroughly explained. The thorough explanation to them will take some time as our intellect develops and as human affairs take on their ultimate expression. So as I understand it then, because I don't know if you know this, but Muhammad Asad has also happened to be one of my favorite translators and you can call it commentaries in his footnotes. And I see that in your 14-volume tafsir, you've utilized the Asad translation. No, not your recent one. This is your own, but the bulky edition 2019. But I've seen in the 14-volume tafsir, you've used that. What I find quite fascinating is that he stayed amongst Bedouins, but and in fact he developed the nuances and the idiosyncrasies of the community of that particular time, and I believe he was also close to the king of Saudi Arabia. But what is remarkable is that his translation is banned in Saudi Arabia, as I understand. In South Africa, I don't know if you are aware of this. The late Sheikh Didat was assaulted when his translation came out in 81, and in 84, 85, Ahmed Didat was circulating this translation together with a group of other individuals within Islamic organizations and movements. And they were assaulted by virtue of the fact that this translation was seen as problematic. I don't see it as problematic, but you'd give the classic example, وَإِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى إِنِّي مُتَوَفِّيكَ وَرَافِعُكَ. So the mutawaffika was translated as causing you to die. Just one verse, Surah Al Imran, verse 55. And, the Muslim community of South Africa back then took a strong stance against this. I don't think they do any longer. But at this point in time, Asad's translation, as I understand it, is not open for public consumption in Saudi Arabia. It's banned, and not many people know about his close relationship with the monarchy, even though he criticized the monarchy in the road to Mecca and which is a cynicism of the whole situation, because it's the most rational, the most accurate English translation, and yet emanating and immersing himself in that society of Saudi Arabia as it was emerging,
he's been rejected in that particular region of the world, which I find quite remarkable.
Yeah, Muhammad Asad is a person just like you and me. He worked his mind on Islamic issues. May Allah reward him for his efforts. And we all have our maybe slips. We slip from time to time, and the Saudis take against him, my understanding, two major issues that he disagrees with the mainstream opinion of Muslims. The first one has to do with this issue of Isa alayhi salam, whether he had died, the death that no one returns from to life, or he did not die. And the word, and all of it centers around, and this question comes up a lot, and now that you bring it up, let me try to explain it. The word in the inni mutawaffika wa rafi'uka ilay, that's the ayah in the Qur'an. Allah says inni, for sure I am, and the word is mutawaffik. And there's two words. I'll explain. There's two words in the Qur'an. One of them is yatawaffa, and the other one is you meet. There's wafah, there's a ta marbuta at the end of the word, and then there's maut. Those are the nouns. So these two words occur these are Quranic words, but they are two different words. And this is the area in which the Muslim mind has not trained itself to distinguish between two different words in the Quran that may appear to be synonymous. And that's why they go about translating different words with one word in the English language, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not mean that one word for all of these different words in the Quran. Take the word kafir and mushrik. So in the English language, here we go. You bounce. They take the word, they'll say kafir and mushrik is unbeliever. Both of them are, or they say kafir and mushrik is heathen, and both of them are heathen. And they this is not, it really is a sad comment on we who are trying to explain the meanings of this Quran. Back to the word mutawaffik. Wafa means I will cause you to expire. And the ultimate expiration is death. So wafa is a generic word that can mean death, but is not limited to death. There's another ayah in the Quran that Allah says, يَتَوَفَّى الْأَنفُسْ حِينَ مَنَامِهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala causes living beings to experience wafa when they are sleeping. So there is a temporary expiration that is experienced by everyone because everyone sleeps. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used that word concerning Isa alayhi salam, he says, mutawaffika wa rafi'uka ilay. I will cause you to be suspended from life. That is the temporary expiration that happens, synonymous to all of us when we go to sleep. Wa rafi'uka ilay. And I will cause you to ascend unto me. So there's another ayah in the Quran, because the Quran explains the Quran. Another ayah in the Quran says, وَيُكَلِّمُ النَّاسَ فِي الْمَهْدِ وَكَهْلًا. So Allah says about Isa, he's going to, and this is referring to Isa's ayat, the miracles that he performed. And by the way, the word ayah does not only mean miracle. And there's the words in the Quran many times are refined by the context that they are in. So the word ayah here is Isa is going to speak to people an impossibility that he's going to perform. Instead of using a miracle, an impossibility that he is going to perform is he's going to speak to people when he's in the cradle. Which baby, a few days old or a few hours old, is going to speak to people from the cradle? Okay, so why does Allah says wakahla when you're in advanced age, when you're an old man, when you're a senior? Well, he said, to the best of all knowledge that we can gather from whichever sources, was in the Judeo-Christian context, he was either killed or crucified when he was 30 or 33. In our context, he was mutawaffa when he was in that age frame. He wasn't a senior. He wasn't an old. So the impossibility or the miracle is he's going to return to speak to people. Then we understand, oh my God, he was not dead. So that is the Qur'an.
If I may take it, I mean, looking at your translation, for example, I don't want this to detract from the overall, but just since you've raised it, you, for example, would translate, Allah says, O Isa, verily I shall cause you to expire from this time and place, and shall raise you unto me and cleanse you of the presence of those who are bent on denying the truth, relating to my power and authority, again in parenthesis. From a theological point of view, then, can you fault a Muslim or a believer who, for example, would use this as a theological basis, or will choose to exegete this as suggesting that Jesus, in fact, did die in a natural course of events? And then, of course, juxtaposing it with وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيَّ يَوْمَ وُلِدْتُ وَيَوْمَ مُوتُ وَيَوْمَ بُعْثُ حَيًّا. When you juxtapose that, would it be theologically inappropriate and inaccurate from a Quranic point of view for a person who simply believes that, tying into account other aspects where Allah does not change his nature, the nature of creation? If somebody reaches that conclusion, can he be faulted for reaching such a conclusion? Leaving aside all the extraneous secondary source material within the Islamic worldview, from the Quranic point of view, would that be an inaccurate approach to adopt?
Yeah, it would be inaccurate and it would be a fault, but it would not be one that is used to bandy around the accusation that a person becomes kafir because of that.
So what I'm saying, Imam, someone can have that belief that the idea in the not that he's crucified. The Quran is clear, وَمَا قَتَلُوا وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ. But I mean, in the natural course of events, death in the natural course of events, there's nothing to suggest that from the Quranic point of view, that someone cannot reach such a conclusion. There's no contrary position to that from the Quranic point of view, that look, he didn't die, he's coming back. Even though some would argue, وَإِنَّهُ لَعِلْمُ لِلسَّاعَةُ فَلَا تَمْتَرُنَّ بِهَا وَاتَّبِعُونَ. Some would argue that's now a reference to his second coming. But I'm saying from the Quranic point of view, because most Muslims have been excommunicated. Even Muhammad Asad, unfortunately, a great man of that caliber, on the basis of this particular verse. And I'm saying that, isn't it about time in 2022, in the 20th century, that we move beyond these kind of insular parochial understandings and look for the possibility that there are other ways that exist in approaching the Quranic text?
Absolutely, because you see, it's been the Saudi grip on the Muslim public sphere in these past 40, 50 years that makes it impossible for a dissenting point of view, which is legitimate and which it has its full-blown explanation. Just as you take a issue with Muhammad Asad, he believed, okay, that's his point of view. He made a mistake. Don't take him to the gallows for making this type of mistake. That's how he sincerely understood this, even though I personally disagree with him 100%. But I wouldn't say I'm going to throw all of his scholarship out of the window because of these. That was one issue that the Saudis have with him concerning Isa alayhi salam.
Yeah.
The other issue is that he did not believe that a Muslim woman, should cover her hair. His definition of hijab is that she would cover from the neck downwards. No maqna'a, no hijab covering the face, no hijab covering the hair. This whole area here can be exposed. And he worked his way to this understanding through his understanding of the ayat of the Qur'an. And he did this sincerely. He wasn't, joking around. He wasn't playing, linguistic games or anything like that. He did. And so agree with him, disagree with him. That's the majority Muslims would say Muhammad Asad on these two issues has erred. The Saudi lobby would say Muhammad Asad is either a dal, which was one of their favorite words, or mubtada, another one of their favorite words, or if you're really there on the extremes, he's a kafir. So that's how they look at things, and so they ban his whole translation of the Qur'an. And this guy MBS right now, who is in power, and he put most of these types who are establishmentarian clergy, he put them behind bars. And he says he's opening up, and and right now there's resorts on the Red Sea, and he's promoting tourism to Saudi Arabia.
That's what I want to ask you, Imam, because although it's not going to go away from our central theme of tonight's discussion, but a few weeks back I asked Ziauddin Sardar, you've probably heard of him, the Islamic futurist who worked very closely with the late marhum Khalim Siddiqui, about the fact that how do you explain this contradiction, the schizophrenic element within Saudi society, that on the one hand, you've got this kind of post-normality in the sense that, yes, on the one hand, there's a level of ultra-conservatism, but at the other hand, there's this level of ultra-liberalism that's immersed together. So, for example, the idea of religious conservatism is manifest large, or purportedly manifest large, within the kingdom and purportedly within the Saudi establishment and amongst the Mutawa and so on. But that, in a sense, is juxtaposed at the same time with the kind of ultra-liberalism and licentiousness that you see. For example, the fact that this man has been engaging in orgies, the fact that he's opened up, his Neon project for 2030 embraces the ultra liberalism of the West, the ultra modernity of the West, the entertainment, the exposure that Western entertainment and society brings. He embraces that, and somehow or the other, you have this conservatism that is side by side, and at the same time, you've got some conservatives that are languishing in jail. I mean, how do you explain this? It's never happened before. You find the schizophrenic approach in Saudi society. What would you say would be the kind of impetus that gave rise to such a phenomenon, which never existed before?
Yeah, well, this is easy to explain. It doesn't take a genius to work this out. What has happened in Saudi Arabia is that the public square there, for the past ever since the petrodollar was in ascendancy, the religious class there was more or less in charge of society. They had nothing to do with foreign policy. They had nothing to do with economics. Their concentration was on education and the street, the public square. That was their whole area of expertise, and they had a free hand. So what they did was they imposed on the Saudi population this type of stern and strict and extreme understanding of Islam, whereby they only, in their presentations, in their khutbahs, in their lectures, in their public talks, all they speak about, the majority of their discussions and their presentations are about bathroom issues and bedroom issues. The female and, her private parts and these types of issues. That's the whole world to them. So this extremism that was, some people could go and live with that comfortably, but that's a small minority of people. The other majority of the population, even though they went along with it, inside of themselves, they lived with a a repression that opposed this. They can't go along with this any longer. So that extremism of what you refer to as conservative Islam, it gave birth to the extremism of liberalism and breaking
modernity
away from Islam altogether. So they want to now. They want to throw out the bath water with the baby. Everything goes out now. We don't want this anymore. So one extremism breeds another extremism, and this is what we have happening in front of our own eyes. And this is what happens when we don't understand Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, and we don't understand His Prophet in the context of understanding Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. If we don't understand them correctly, we're gonna bounce from the detriment of this Wahhabi Salafi interpretation and understanding of Islam now to what we have as they call themselves the enlightened or the progressive or the modernistic understanding of Islam. And here we are. And this extremism itself is going to, give it time, give it another 5-10 years, it's going to feed into the other extremism. And they will continue to go this way because they have not centralized the Qur'an and the Prophet's teaching in their lives. They hijacked certain ayat and certain hadiths. Actually, they give precedence to their own hadiths, and then the ayat, they come secondary. They tell you you can't understand the Quran without understanding a hadith, where it's supposed to be the other way around. You can't understand the hadith without understanding the Quran, because the Quran is supposed to fit into the framework. The hadith is supposed to fit into the framework of the Quran. They tell you no. The ayah is supposed to fit into the framework of the hadith. And we know the hadith, that's another issue. It's a broad issue that all the Muslims have been delinquent on because they have not filtered hadith literature. Hadith literature has to be filtered. We have to get rid of the nonsensical hadith that are contrary to the meanings of the ayat of the Quran. All Muslims agree the Quran is Allah's final word. There has not been one change in one word in the Quran. But the hadiths, we have a da'if hadith, we have a hasan hadith, we have a sahih hadith, we have a manhul hadith, we have a makdhub hadith, and it goes on and on and on.
Maudu as well. And I mean, and they are found in the Sihah Sitta, they're found in Bukhari and Muslim, but it seems to me that this emotional attachment to names and to authority prevents Muslims from, engaging in that level of critique and criticism in relation to the hadith corpus, from what I can gather, which is problematic at all levels. I just want to move beyond that. In coming back to your Quran, I do see, and I've seen particularly in your 14th volume, that you do make mention particularly about, for example, I think you allude to them, Fi Zilal al-Quran by Sayyid Qutb and the Tafhim al-Quran by Maududi. Now, I haven't had access to the Arabic. I've only had access to the English of these volumes. I think the 30 volume of Sayyid Qutb and the 20 volume of Maududi published by the Islamic Foundation. Do you find these tafsir, I mean, as it's been translated in English and available to many of our modern English speakers in the Muslim world, do you find them still relevant in 2022, or are they products of a particular milieu and climate where these specific authors in fact came from? I mean, because both of them were not, in a sense, they are rejected by the conservatives, but are viewed by the Islamophobes as the so-called founders of Islamic radicalism in the world, which is also totally nonsensical. But how would you view Qutb's Fi Zilal al-Quran and Maududi? Maududi was, I think somewhat more misogynistic in his positioning and his views. How have they influenced your particular approach in translating the Quran and certainly in giving your own tafsir?
Well, let me put it this way. First, I would like to say that Sayyid Qutb and Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, I've read everything that they wrote. Sayyid Qutb for sure. Mawdudi, everything that was translated into Arabic, I read. And I have to say that some of my intellectual Islamic formation way back when I was a high school student and a university student, it belongs to these two among a few others, but basically to these two, and Muhammad Qutb also. I think they had a very good understanding of how Islam is independent from the internal condition, that the weakness Muslims have been suffering from, and at the same time from the external forces that have been assaulting the Islamic homelands, basically from originating from Europe. So they had a good understanding of what they didn't use this word very much, but understanding them, I used it often, and that is Islamic self-determination. This word has to be ingrained in every Muslim mind to get an understanding of our responsibilities as a social character in the world. What the Saudi finances have done, the havoc that they have played internally with the Muslims, is they've taken the focus of the Muslim public away from its social character and then fragmented us, or they concretized our fragmentation to the extent that we lost sight of the fact that we are an independent presence in this world for the good of humanity, not only for ourselves, but for the good of humanity. And so I would say that the thrust of Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi and the thrust of Sayyid Qutb in the context of their own times was a light in the darkness of the Muslim peoples. They had their own issues to deal with. Mawdudi had his issues with, India and how to crystallize Islamic self-determination. And that's why you see he had one opinion at one time concerning remaining within India, and then another opinion the other time as Pakistan came into existence. Sayyid Qutb had his also ijtihad concerning Arab nationalism and the havoc it has played with distancing the Arab Muslims from the rest of the Muslim world. And obviously he paid with his life for that principled position. And yeah, I admire their input into the last 100 years of the Muslims, and I think that the Saudi, there are the Wahhabi Salafi extremists who go to the extent of saying Sayyid Qutb was a kafir, and so was Mawdudi, and all of this.
But didn't they support them? I mean, in as I understand it, because it is so, these things shift and change. I mean, initially the Ikhwan was, for example, supported by the Saudi establishment, as I understand, back in the 60s. And the same thing with Jamaat-e-Islami. There was a stage in the 60s and I believe the 50s where they were supported by the Saudi establishment. What happened afterwards? Something changed. There was a paradigm shift that happened in the 70s and, of course, in the 80s. As I understand it.
Yeah, there's a confluence of factors that brought distance between the Saudi regime on one side and the Islamic activist movements.
Was it theological? Was it theological or political?
No. To begin with, it was all of this was political. There was a life and death struggle between King Faisal in Saudi Arabia and Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. They fought a proxy war in Yemen. Yemen became the Vietnam of the Egyptians. And King Faisal saw that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was a natural ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So along those political bases, it had nothing to do with, because Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Hassan al-Banna said, we are a Sufi movement.
They were not Wahhabi. It's strange in a sense that the Wahhabis supported them, but they were not Wahhabis.
And this is where politics trumps theology. It's the political priorities that sideline the theological Sufi Wahhabi differences. This was no time to get in. Faisal understood, and my understanding is Faisal in his last couple of years was becoming more independent, moving in the right direction. That's why, in my opinion, he was killed by the CIA. He was killed by the United States. He told Henry Kissinger, this was in the aftermath of the 1973 oil embargo. He took him to the window. He was there in his palace. He said, "Look out there." Kissinger looked out of the window and he saw this sand. It was just barren sand out there. Faisal told him it wasn't long ago when we were living in tents out there in this sand. And if the liberation of Jerusalem dictates for us to return to those tents in that sand, we will return. And Faisal gave Kissinger a copy of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Now, what an insult that is. And you think they took this lying down and, he's just a crazy king or something like that. Yeah, this guy is going in the wrong direction. Let's move him out of the way. So it was the political necessities that brought together Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt with the Saudi rulers. And they opened up, the Saudi rulers at the time in the 1960s and 70s, they opened up everything. They gave them educational opportunities. They placed them in the universities. They were now the Ikhwan of Egypt and of other Arab countries, but mostly the Egyptians were putting together the syllabi and the curriculum in the Saudi educational system. They were professors at universities. They were given passports. All of this was because of the reaction, the Saudi Arabian officialdom's reaction to Jamal Abdel Nasser and Arab nationalism. Had nothing to do with, look, we are principled Muslims and we are going to go by our Islamic standards and our Islamic teachings. Had nothing to do with that. And then later on, unfortunately, because the Ikhwan, those who resettled in Saudi Arabia, as time passed by, they gradually moved from their original Sufi orientation of Hassan al-Banna, and now some of them became Wahhabis or semi-Wahhabis and semi-Salafis, some of them. We have to be very clear on this point, because some people, they'll listen to this and then they'll generalize. They'll say the Ikhwan became Salafis and the Ikhwan became this. And some of them did. That's true. And to the extent where it's said that Saudi Arabia has become the graveyard of the Islamic movement because of this shift from tasawwuf to tasalluf.
I want to stop you then and just explain to me this dichotomy, because I've asked many scholars as well out there, but I don't kind of get a satisfactory answer. In the world today, if you look at most of the Islamophobes, they make the argument that when you look at modern forms of Islamic radicalism, they somehow or the other, either consciously or subconsciously, are influenced by the ideological leanings of what was then Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Jamaat Islami, many of the classical Islamic movements, and the works of Qutb and Maududi. However, when you look at Qutb, when you look at, for example, his mentor Hassan al-Banna, and when you go back even further back, the mentors of Hassan al-Banna, people like Jamaluddin Afghani and Mufti Muhammad Abdu, these were viewed as founders of Islamic modernism, or as I understand, within academic discourse, these are viewed as the Islamic modernists. Rashid Rida, Mufti Muhammad Abdu, Jamaluddin Afghani, these are viewed as Islamic modernists. And yet it is Islamic modernism that gave rise to Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which kind of evolved and emerged. And today, the irony of the whole situation is that that is viewed as the kind of so-called spiritual godfathers to modern-day Islamic radicalism. Do you see that as an exercise in cynicism, that it is Islamic modernity that gave rise to the Islamic movements?
Well, it's a very, very wide subject that you can open up in this regard.
I don't want to delve into that, but just as a thought that just crossed my mind since you raised the point.
You see, there's two elements that feed into your question. One of them is the Libyan sponsorship of tasawwuf to counter Saudi Arabia. There was a behind the scenes battle going on in Africa and in Muslim countries between the Salafi line of the Saudis, which was now using certain sectors of Jamaat Islami and the Ikhwan on one side. And then there was the Libyans, Gaddafi and his regime, who were using a tasawwuf to counter that. What complicates things more is that in the middle of all of this, the Islamic Revolution in Iran took place. And here Saudi Arabia, just as it was the avowed enemy of Abdel Nasser in Egypt, became the avowed enemy of Imam Al Khomeini in Iran. And in this mesh of political, religious turf war, in this triangular Islamic setup, the Ikhwan, some of them sort of took a neutral role towards Iran. Well, let's wait and see how this thing is going to work out. Another faction of them was totally and solidly in the Saudi camp. And then there's some individuals that sort of went with Libya and this type of thing that was going on then. So the Ikhwan as an organization on record did not commit itself to anyone in the middle of all of this. It is not on record as being with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, even though there were contacts and back and forth between them. The Ikhwan are not on record, and I think Jamaat Islami is the same way, because they are sort of twins when they make up these decisions. They are not on record supporting the Saudi regime, even though the Saudis have been nurturing their activities for decades, but still they did not say that we are for the Saudis. Also, a little complicating factor here is that some of them found shelter, some of these Ikhwani decision makers or influential characters, they found shelter in Qatar, which was positioning itself, and you can see it extending up until this day, positioning itself in a comfortable position within this ongoing competition in Africa and in Asia. And not to make things more difficult to understand, but along comes the rulers in Turkey, and they feed into this type of triangulation that was going on. And then you have what we have now with Syria and Iraq.
Well, it's a complicated situation, but I don't want to delve into too much of that. But it raises the thematic outline of my next discussion with you is the issue of power and politics within the Quranic context. Now, we know at the outset, and this is quite evident in your tafsir, is that the Quran describes itself as a kind of a manual outlining, how to live, how to, for example, the moral and ethical framework in terms of embracing both the individual and the collective, in terms of how to regulate ourselves. And you can clearly see this in for example, in Surah Taha, Surah 20, verse 43, which, for example, deals with the excesses committed by tyrants, transgressors, people of the Ad. They lived amongst tyrants and so on and so forth. But this takes me to the next issue, and I want your take and thoughts on this, is that from my understanding and reading, and even from reading your, I'm talking about this translation here, which I'm thoroughly enjoying to read, is that you don't find a prescriptive view of a specific kind of political system or a system of governance in the Quran itself. In other words, the vision of leadership or the vision of governance in the Quran could, for example, lead to a multiplicity of understandings in terms of how this can happen. And why I'm raising this is that there has been this call amongst many Muslims in recent years, over the past few decades, of establishing the Khilafah, establishing the Caliphate, as they would call. You've got groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, and you've got crazy groups like Al-Muhajirun and, death cults like ISIS, for example, talking about Caliphate, going back to the Caliphate, going back to what happened, re-establishing the Caliphate. And yet, would I be correct, as you've understood with words like Muslim and, for example, Mu'min, that the word Khilafah, from the Quranic point of view, is generic? It means someone that is a vicegerent, someone that is in position of trusteeship of Allah. It could apply to every single human being on earth. Would that not necessarily lead us to the conclusion that the whole notion of establishing the Caliphate or the Khilafah, in fact, is an atomization of the word Khilafah as it's contained in the Quran? We understand there is a historical background behind it, but in modern times, in modern society, in 21st century society, talking about establishing the Khilafah is looking at history anachronistically and attempting to impose certain principles that emerged in certain contexts and believing that they operate or work now. What would your take be on that?
Yeah, here we go back to the scrutinizing of words. The word khilafa and the word khalifa and the word khala'if, these are Quranic words.
Yes.
And they have specific Quranic meanings that are fine-tuned in the context that they are in. Never in the Quran will we find these words having the meaning that they are mentioned in today's discourse when they say, the affairs of the Muslims will not return to normal unless there is a khilafah. And the Muslims need a khalifa, and so forth and so on. What's happening here with the people who use this terminology, I know Hizb ut-Tahrir very well, and I'm not trying to take away from their merits. But what's happening with them who use this word is that they are influenced by Islamic history more than they are influenced by the Islamic Qur'an. And I've been trying to work on this issue for some time now in speaking and in writing to explain the Khilafah, what happened after the Prophet passed away. These types of people, whether they're speaking about Khilafah, and most of these are Sunnis, or whether they are speaking about Imama, and most of them are Shi'is, They are basically, their springboard is Islamic history. It's not Islamic principles. It's not Islamic ideology. It's not any of this. So these words have to be liberated. That's the whole effort here. We're liberating the words from their historical baggage and loads, and then replacing them in the original context expressed by Allah in the Qur'an and expressed by the Prophet in the context of the Qur'an. If these two just would avoid these buzzwords, khilafa and imama, avoid these buzzwords and use Islamic governance or Islamic decision-making or Islamic rule, then they will bring more Muslims into the point that they are trying to make, and that is, we are Muslims that need our own government to be decided by us, not to be decided by foreign powers, not to be decided by agents acting as proxies of foreign powers, has to be decided by the me and you in the Islamic context. A process that has been absent since the assassination of Imam Ali. There hasn't been an Islamic rule that got the Muslims themselves involved in deciding who's going to be making their decisions for them. It became a matter of usurping power. And that is why it is extremely important to understand these ayat of the Qur'an in the context of Allah's authority and power in our lives and in our society. That's why you will find that refrain many times in explaining these ayat in the Qur'an.
So if you look then, for example, and just to wrap up on this theme, Allah has made you successor on the Khilafah, Surah 24, verse 55, 35, 39, 6, verse 165. Would I then be correct in coming to the conclusion that the conceptual introduction of the term Khalifa is divorced from political implications? Because many people atomize the term, and I'm saying that, you could make the argument that from the Quranic point of view, that idea, that conceptual idea, is divorced of a political implication, in the sense that if, for example, there was some sort of obligation in the sense of establishing what could be described as a delegated political authority or political representation, or the specific sense, a kind of a political institution, that would have been spelled out in the Quran. But by and large, it essentially it gives you the bare bones. In other words, the Islamic concept of governance is one of ethics, justice, and morality, but it gives you the bare bones to develop that system dependent on the context in which you are, in fact, living in. Would that be accurate in understanding it from that perspective?
Yeah, it would be accurate. It would be accurate. You see, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa." I am, Allah speaking to the angels, to the malaika. "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa." I'm
establishing, creating a vicegerent or successor, referring to man, but that's in reference to man, generic.
Yeah, or a deputy or a second in charge. All of these, mesh these words together, and then take this, and then they say, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. Are you going to have on that earth, in that life there, مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا, someone's going to, these types were going to cause corruption all around. So with the dialogue here between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the malaika is about this Khalifa on earth, this person who's going to be deputized to do what is right on earth. They object to that, said, but there's going to be a lot of corruption. There's going to be a lot of mayhem. There's going to be a lot of killing. There's going to be a lot of massacres and all of this going on earth. قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. He answered them, I know what you do not know. Now, in flipping the pages of history, we see that what the Malaika were saying is true. Look at all this stuff that's going on earth. There isn't a generation that is void of wars. There's wars going on all over the place, bloodshed on earth and all of this. So if we're understanding the scope of this ayah, and this is only one ayah, you can visit the other ayat in the Qur'an. If we're visiting this one scope of ayah, was Allah speaking about inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa? In the historical definition of the word khalifa, not the Quranic, in the historical and in the establishmentarian definition of khalifa, the first khalifa was Abu Bakr, and then Umar and Uthman. So when Allah is saying, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, is he saying that I am, appointing Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman? Of course not.
Of course
yes.
not. Of course
yeah.
not.
But this is how ridiculous the issue becomes when people confuse the hijacking of a word throughout the generations in history by power establishments who were not totally legitimate. And I'm not speaking about the Khulafa. I'm speaking about Muawiyah and the monarchies and the self-rule that followed that up until our present time. We're still living the after effects of all of that. When we confuse that with the original Quranic word.
And then that takes me also to the next fascinating point, is that you've also identified this, as people like Muhammad Asad have identified, even the term Muslim. I've seen you in your translation. He makes the point in his introduction that in the classical period, during the time of the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, that the term Muslim didn't have that circumscribed significance, historically speaking, as it does in our times, where you kind of reduce it. It has a reductionist sense of being very labelistic. But in the classical period, in the time of the Prophet, it was very much of a descriptive, something describing a state of being, something which is adjectival. Is that the reason why you've translated the word Muslim in a generic sense? Or I think in certain passages you may have translated as just simply submitting. So do you see it as not a label, not something that people appropriate themselves in distinguishing themselves from other religious worldviews, but more particularly as a natural way, as the only way, as a kind of a state of being, as opposed to something which is inherently labelistic? Would that be correct in how you would understand the term Muslim?
Yeah,
or the Quranic understanding of the term Muslim, as opposed to, because conventionally, Muslims are viewed as a label with a particular religious background vis-a-vis Christians, Jews, Hindus, etc., etc. But from the Quranic point of view, or the Quranic stylistic rendering of the term, does not in any way present it as a kind of a label, but uses it in a generic sense. So one could make the argument that, if you look at the Kopauku tribes of Papua, before they met civilized man in the 1920s, what was the religion they followed? One could make the argument they were Muslim in everything but name. So is that your understanding of the term Muslim? Because when we adopt that particular position, it takes us beyond the kind of low-level engagements that is so destructive and meaningless in the long term and has created so much of division, artificial constructs. And then, of course, even lower, below that, the artificial constructs of the Shiite and the Sunni divide and all these fangled theologies that have developed to justify these ideological positions that people take.
Exactly. The word Muslim is a description of those who find themselves secondary to the higher authority of the ultimate authority. That is the description. You see, there's an ayah in the Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat. Some people come up and say, وَقَالَتِ الْأَعْرَابُ آمَنَّا. The Arabians said, but we are committed Muslims. We are mu'mineen. قُلْ لَمْ تُؤْمِنُوا وَلَكِنْ قُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا. The response to them, say to them, no, you have not attained that level of commitment to Allah, but you are Muslims, meaning in the civil sense now that you are a part of an Islamic reality, you are considered Muslims. And this can extend to those who are outside of the Islamic realm in the world. There are many people in the world who don't know, who don't have information about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about all, and if they do have this information, it is inaccurate, it is defamatory, and it is basically meant to have them misunderstand what Islam is, what al-Iman is. So all, this brings to mind a little, this probably, even though it's a little story here, it'll take a few minutes, but it will tell you what is going on. One of the shuyukh in Lebanon went to Saudi Arabia and he met Ibn Baz. That was the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia in the 60s, 70s, and later on. He passed away some years ago. He had a cordial setting with him. They're talking, it's different things. So this scholar, Lebanese scholar, asks Ibn Baz, okay, Maulana, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes al-Jannah, paradise, عرضها كعرض السماوات والأرض. The width of it is the extent of as-samawati wal-ard. He said, yes, that's the description of it. He said, okay, so now who's going to be in this Jannah? He said, obviously the Muslims are going to be in this Jannah. He said, okay, who are the Muslims? He said, well, the Muslims are the muwahhideen. He said, okay, who are the muwahhideen? He said, those who ma ana alayhi wa ashabi, what the Prophet was following and his companions. He said, okay, in today's world, who are they? He said, well, we have them here in Saudi Arabia and in some other places. He said, okay, just give me a figure. Just tell me how you estimate how many. He said, maybe about 30, 40 million in the world. He said, Maulana, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth with the width, the paradise, the width of the heaven and the earth for 20 or 30 million people.
I mean, he believed the earth was flat, didn't he?
Yeah, the same one who believed.
It's amazing. I want to ask you something else, Imam. In your book, and I'm talking about the recent translation done by you. I see, for example, and I'm just opening it cursorily, Surah Baqarah, the discussion, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ لَا تُفْسِدُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. And then, of course, following that surah, verse 14, وَإِذَا لَقُوا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا قَالُوا آمَنَّا وَإِذَا خَلَوْا إِلَى شَيَاطِينِهِمْ قَالُوا إِنَّا مَعَكُمْ إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُسْتَهْزِئُونَ. If you look at this, and of course the preceding verses, it speaks about the munafiqeen, I think from the munafiqs from verse 8. But what I find, I would say fascinating, is that you choose to translate it as the political hypocrites, description of the political hypocrites. For example, in verse 8, you say, and from among the people, there are those who say, we commit ourselves to Allah and affirm the last day, but in reality, they are not committed to Allah. And in verse 11, and if they, and in parentheses, you've got there, the political hypocrites are told, do not cause corruption on earth. They answer, we are but resolving issues. My question is that, is that a definitive only translation, or is that one amongst many? Is that an interpretation that is kind of inclusive? In other words, is that an exclusive translation, or is that an inclusive translation, meaning hypocrites could comprise a vast array of individuals? You've chosen to understand it as political hypocrites. And of course, you can apply it in today's context to various individuals in the Muslim world. You can talk about, for example, the Saudi establishment, political hypocrites. But is that what the actual verse originally? I mean, in the classical tafsir, none of them come to that particular conclusion. You look at Ibn Kathir, even some of the more rational ones like Fakhruddin Razi and Zamakhshari, for example, they don't have that exegesis on that particular passage. They, for example, either some of them, they make it historically specific during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, or munafiq in the sense of people affirming Islam theologically, and then inside their hearts, they reject it. But you've taken the position of political hypocrites. What's your base? What's your exegetical model for that?
Well, you see, the word also nifaq and munafiqeen, this has to be understood in the all-out effort of Islam to actualize its potential in society and in the world. So when these ayat in the Qur'an are speaking about al-munafiqeen, they are speaking about a class of people who verbally state that they are Muslims, but who in reality, with their deeds and their actions, they are opposed to the actualization of Islam in its full potential. They would not be opposed to Islam being expressed in the masajid. They would not be opposed to Islam being reduced to rituals. But if you come and speak about Islam as an economic order, or you come to speak about Islam as a power structure, then they are opposed to it. So they are living a dual personality. On the surface, they say we are Muslims. You go to the masjid, they'll be in the first line of salah. Some of them will be leading the salah, and they be the imams in the salah. But in reality, deep down inside of them, their heart is with those who are against Islam as a full-blown society and order. This is the general description of hypocrite. And that's why I tried to capture this as political hypocrites. When it comes to issues of policy making, then their appearance is not what they really are. وَإِذَا خَلَى, the ayah that you just, وَإِذَا خَلَوْا إِلَى شَيَاطِينِهِمْ قَالُوا إِنَّا مَعَكُمْ. And if they are in the private company of their demons, which if you review the tafsirs, they will say these are the Yahud of the Arabian Peninsula. I say, but we're with you. And this is exactly what is happening in today's world. You have these figures who, when it comes to Islam, say, but we are Muslims. We are with you. إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ مُصْلِحُونَ. We are doing what is for the betterment of you and society and us and everyone else. When they come and meet their superiors, whether it's privately, and most of these are privately because they never can expose themselves to the reality because everyone will begin to see who they are. So they're speaking two languages, one of them with their superiors and the other one is with their comrades or with their peers. And these are the munafiqeen. And what defines them is what is precisely political. And I don't mean political in the nasty definition of the word, because the word politics and politicians, it has a secular, derogative understanding too. I'm talking about it in the clean sense of the word. People who are making decisions for society, the public servants of society. So when they are treasonous towards the principles of Allah and His Prophet in this particular area, it's not, like the establishmentarian ulama say that a hypocrite is one who lies. And one who lies is a liar. There's a word for that. Kadhibun. It's a Quranic word.
Yes.
Yeah. But a munafiq is something else. They are dual loyalists. They are multi-loyalists. They are not Unitarian loyalists to Allah and His Prophet.
So why did the classical Mufassirin not recognize this aspect? Well, I mean, obviously the context and time was different, but I mean, in the way that you've explained it, most of the classical Mufassirin understand the idea of munafiq in a kind of a theological sense, in the sense that someone is affirming or averring that, look, we are Muslim, but inside they actually theologically opposed to Islam. You are not making your definition is distinct in the sense that, look, they could even be theologically affirming Islam at one level, at a superficial level, from the perspective relativism, religious prayer, religious worship, but politically, they seem to be opposed to the kind of establishment of Islamic governance, as I understand your particular take on it.
Yeah, my answer to that is probably not the final answer, but my answer to that is these mufassirin and these fuqaha and these types of commentators on the meanings of the ayat of the Qur'an did not have the courage within themselves to take on those initial political developments that occurred after the Prophet's life. They pretty well, I mean, it's not satisfactory in my opinion, but they pretty well cover the seerah of the Prophet when he was alive. So when Muslims who were in Al-Madinah and the Muslims who were in Al-Hijaz and the Muslims who were in Arabia beyond that, beyond Al-Madinah and Al-Hijaz, and you try to identify, okay, there are so many ayat in the Qur'an about al-munafiqeen. Okay, who are these munafiqeen? If there's so many ayat in the Qur'an that speak about munafiqeen, who are they? And then you'll be hard-pressed to come up with 7 or 8 names. That's it. All of these ayat in the Qur'an about Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. And there are a few other. Okay, how about 1/3 of the army that went out to battle with the Prophet, and then halfway there or thereabouts, they say, nah, I don't think this is the right decision. We're going back to Al-Madinah. Who are they? So we've had an inability of the Muslim mind to probe this history, even in the time of the Prophet.
They were his companions. They were his companions who would otherwise be described as Sahaba, yet they turned against him.
And some of this literature, they'll tell you these are companions. Okay, they're companions. So why did they go back to Al-Madinah? And why did Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, لَيُخْرِجَنَّ الْأَعَزُّ مِنْهَا الْأَذَلُ? The superior one, once we return to Al-Madinah, is going to expel the inferior one. That's a jab at Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But I mean, they concentrate.
So there's an inherent fear, as I understand. Would you say then the classical mufassirin had an inherent fear to spell out who the would this fear also, for example, extend to the fuqaha? If you look at, for example, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, I mean, a lot of them were tortured. Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, were they? I mean, at the time that they developed the Jews, of course, we don't have any writings of Imam Abu Hanifa, but we've got the Hanafi, the Al-Hidayah, which was done by students, and some of the manuals of Imam Shafi, the Imdat al-Salik, and so on. By Shafi scholars, but would the fuqaha, for example, the fact that they were not they developed a body of jurisprudence, but they were not rulers of society, they were just simply framers of the law. Was the jurisprudence developed to fit into line with, for example, the rise of the Abbasids? Well, was it developed particularly because that is what the modern day, much of the rubric of Sharia today comprises of fiqh, which is developed by the fuqaha, but that was developed within the Abbasid context. Would you make the same argument then that the fuqaha, for example, developed the jurisprudence based on their relationship with the leaders of their time, and therefore, a lot of it, for example, amounted to a compromise? Some of it was the inherent flaws in the jurisprudence could not be easily identified. And therefore, when you have the imposition of the Sharia in the 21st century, you have this disconnect that exists. Would you extend the argument to that?
Well, I would be more careful with my words. I would not say that they feared. I would say that they were cautious. They did not want in their writings, because if you cover their writings, they did not go on extended political discourse to expose the errant ways of the rulers. But as far as their behavior is concerned, they were in opposition as persons, as a faqih. Yeah. They did not agree with the rulers and the establishments of their time. So we have to be very careful here when we speak about these fuqaha. That's not to say that they had some students or they had some affiliates who were working with the system. they felt comfortable, and they just became, part of the status quo. But they themselves and many of their students, no, they took a position that, at least in a passive way, indicates that they were not agreement. That's in the least, because Imam Shafi'i came close to being executed.
Yes.
Imam Malik had his arms injured. Some say to the extent that they were paralyzed, because
they were tortured by their leaders, by the leaders of their time.
Abu Hanifa was in support of the uprising of An-Nafs al-Zakiyya. He gave the money that was coming to him to support that uprising. So in practical fact, as far as their personal behavior is concerned, it tells you that they were against the rulers. But in their scholarly work, they did not work out in a mental sense for them, their students, and the generations to come, at least the theoretical line to oppose those who have usurped power.
So that takes me then, to that issue, is that when, for example, you look at something like the Sharia, and I know in the Quran, the one verse, لِكُلِّ جَعَلْنَا مِنْكُمْ شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا, again, the word shir'ataw, or an opening way, is used in a very generic sense from the Quranic point of view. But, I had this conversation with Ziauddin about a month or two back, and his perspective and take is that Sharia should be viewed as a kind of a problem-solving methodology. And the argument that he makes is that this can be derived from the Quran itself, that the Quran, in fact, lays down the absolute reference frame, and you develop the solutions to the problems in society using the Quran and the prophetic paradigm as a reference point in finding solutions to the problem. Therein lies the establishment of the Sharia. What he says, on the other hand, is that many of the contemporary problems that arise in Muslim societies arise out of the fact that the Sharia has, in a sense, been relegated to the domains of law, in the sense that it's been the exclusive concern of a particular class of scholars who've been preoccupied with jurisprudence or legal rulings by some of the classical ulama, or modern lawyers who, for example, understand it using the tools of Western systems. What would your take be on that? Because it seems to me, Imam, and it's something that I want to establish, that when people talk about imposing the Sharia today, the Taliban or ISIS or anything, for any other insane, crazy group out there, or even a kind of a balanced Muslim organization, when they talk about establishing the Sharia, in actual fact, they're calling for the establishment of fiqh, which developed in a particular context and emerged in a particular context, and eventually became fossilized and static without any kind of change. Is that one of the problems why, whenever we have the establishment of an Islamic state, you see it totally divorced from society, and the contradictions that were inherent in the formulation of the fiqh finds its manifestation in the 21st century, and therefore you find this disconnect happening?
Yeah, this brings us to one of these issues that is, because our mind is lazy and we don't think about these matters systematically and collectively, it seems like it's a gap that people can't get a very good hold on. The word in the Quran, shara'a lakum min ad-din ma wassa bihi, and then it goes on to mention the Anbiya. So the word shara'a, he has, and they translate it as legislate, but shara'a is taking from a course. He has given you a course from a deen, from a larger reality. Sharia is a portion of a larger reality.
Yeah.
And it is understood, more or less, it is understood as the legalistic part of a deen. And then if you break it down more, okay, whose legalism are we talking about? Are we talking about Malik? Are we talking about Abu Hanifa? Whose legalism are we talking about over here? But what everyone is, when we take a look at Taliban and and the Saudis, for example, these are the ones who want to implement law when there is no morality behind or substantiating that law. It took 13 years of raising the moral character of the Muslims to begin to have laws in Al-Medina. This moral character right now happens to be absent by and large. And if there is a morality, it is defined only as a sexual morality, whatever that may mean for different people, or it is defined as a neighbor morality. In other words, the morality itself has suffered a reductionist, it has suffered and become a reductionist definition. This, we have to go back to understand that the basis of a Sharia that we are talking about, the basis of it is our moral growth. We cannot have the implementation of Sharia when we have lying, not telling the truth as a permanent feature in society. How can you have that?
You cannot.
You're going to begin to have holes. You're going to begin to build. You're going to begin to try to build a ceiling without having walls to it. And this is what's happening now. That's why it seems hypocritical. Why are these people, coming down? And they come down, these people right now have power, whether they are in Afghanistan or any other place. They are coming down on the less fortunate in society. Secure for them the necessities of life at the bare minimum. That is the least we can expect of your morality, that hunger no longer exists in society. In the time of Umar, radiallahu anhu, when there was a famine, he suspended the law. He said, we cannot take a thief and apply al-had to him, the penalty, the Islamic penalty to him, when we cannot secure food for him. So the Sharia was suspended when there was not enough moral, whatever it takes, to give people the necessities of life. How can you impose a Sharia on a people who are struggling just to live from day to day? It's like saying we want to take Al-Medina, the facts of Al-Medina, and say this should have been applied in Mecca. No, that wasn't the case.
But is that not the issue? And you hit it right specifically on the nail. Is that the establishment of the Sharia lies in establishing the essential socioeconomic structure in which people find themselves relatively safe and secure. But it seems that in today's society, whenever you've got the implementation of the Sharia, in reality, establishing one or two aspects of the hudud, which is the limits, the outer parameters of the Sharia, that is put in place to kind of dupe society into believing that, look, there's some semblance of Sharia here. But I'm saying, leave aside the ethics and morality. We know for a fact that you've got an immoral monarchy. You know the fact that in Afghanistan and many of these other places, the Taliban are devoid of proper intellectual engagement with the Qur'an. I'm saying that purely from the perspective of the legalistic rulings of the classical imams, would you agree, Imam, that they were specifically space and time bound? And when we are calling for the implementation of the Sharia and at the same time appealing to the establishment of fiqh, we are dealing with the establishment of the Sharia very anachronistically. Because if something developed in the 11th and 12th century using the absolute reference frame, which is the Qur'an and possibly the ethical paradigm or the prophetic paradigm, in the context of the 11th century to find problems for the 11th and the 12th century or the 10th century, how could you utilize those juristic interpretations for the 21st century when the problems we've got are totally different. We've got genetic engineering. You've got, for example, I mean, for heaven's sake, there's no analogies, for example, in relation to climate change. There are no analogies, for example, in terms of GMOs. You can't draw any analogies. And isn't there a fundamental problem at that level, leaving aside the fact that you've already got a dislocated, immoral political class in the Muslim world? At the broad level, at the academic level, that is where the problem lies. Would you say that is a correct assessment?
Yes, generally what you just expressed is correct, generally speaking. And which brings us to the point of, did Islam freeze? Did our relationship with our understanding of the Qur'an and the Prophet, was it frozen 1,000 years ago when these fuqaha produced their fiqh for their own generation and their own time? And we are incapable now, even after all of these years and after all of this knowledge that has accumulated since then, are we incapable of reproducing the equivalent of a Shafi'i or the equivalent of...
That's the assumption. That is the assumption.
Yeah, but we should. Allah did not reveal to us a message that got frozen in time. We can't go back to that time. So we are required to think through this message, this revelation that we have, and the information that goes to it. It's good. These fuqaha, and there's plenty of them, Sunnis and Shiites, they all have a library of effort that they placed into understanding the issues of that day. Okay, that can be used as helping material in us to produce our, because the word fiqh is the answer, the practical answer to the rising issues of the time. And Imam Shafi'i had one fiqh in Egypt. When he went to Iraq, he had another fiqh. He disagreed with his own self just because he was in Egypt at one time, and then he went to Iraq and saw another society, another set of variables and factors interplaying. He changed his own opinion. And that's one person in one generation. The difference was he went from one country to the next country. Well, how about going from one century to the next century and going from one millennium to the next millennium? Amazing. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done.
And I think it's a sign of intellectual laziness on the part of Muslims that do not want to take this approach. I think it's a sense of security where you rely on the works of the traditional fuqaha as the end all and the be all, and attempt to implement that in the 21st century. That's where the anachronism arises, you see, because you then following the context, which is not your context. They develop something for their context, and you are relying on their context, which is totally out of place with 2022 or the 21st century. I want to take you to something else, Imam, where you, for example, give an explanation here, and maybe you can explain it in Surah 65, which is Surah At-Talaq. Rasulan yatlu alaykum ayatillahi mubayyinatin, where you basically translate it as he has sent, that's Allah has sent the apostle, who correlates for you Allah's clear demonstrations of power and authority, so that he might extricate those who are committed to him and do what is right and righteous from obscurity into light. Now, I see this theme playing out in a lot of your in your tafsir, firstly, and certainly in this translation here, particularly, that whilst conventionally this would be translated as Allah has sent an apostle who shows you his signs, ayat. You've chosen to translate it as Allah's clear demonstrations of power and authority. Again, that is a slightly unconventional way. I wouldn't say it's wrong, because I have no problem with accepting it, but that would be viewed as unconventional in the classical sense of how this verse has been translated. Would you agree with that?
Well, this is breaking new grounds. When I translate something like that into these unfamiliar terms, yeah, some people are going to say, what is this? Well, how did it? Okay, let's visit this. Now that you bring the issue up, the word.
Well, what if you make the argument? I don't want to interrupt you, but what if the argument is made? Well, look, you are reading. You have as some would argue that people sometimes have a conclusion and they read it into the text. What if the argument is made against you by others to say, well, look, you've got a view of, divine power, authority, and, the establishment of some sort of authority or domain or political authority. And so you're tying that up with your understanding of this particular verse. I mean, could that be a bit of a stretch? Because I haven't seen any translator. I haven't come across. I've got a litany of Quranic translators, but this is just one verse. But it seems to be the central theme in most of the other. For example, even before that, whoever is conscious and protective of Allah, and again in parenthesis, His power, He will bring relief of the onerous state of affairs. Or whoever is conscious and protective of Allah and His power for justice. So the theme that runs through is always power, authority, power, realigning man with the divine power structure, which is unique. And I think yours are probably the only translation in the world that has this. I'm not so sure if anyone has picked this up or pointed this out to you, but I see that theme, and I've seen that from the time I picked up your first volume in 2009.
Yeah, because there's a lot to be said here. Let me put it this way. Let me try to answer you this way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ourselves cannot say who Allah is. It is only up to Allah to tell us who He is. And He did. He presented us with about 100 attributes of Him. Asma'ullahi al-husna. If we look at these attributes of His, we find that we can place them in two categories. One of these categories is the attributes of Jamal, His beauty attributes, and the other one is His attributes of Jalal, His majesty attributes. These two categories of His attributes can be condensed into two words. The attributes of Jamal can be summarized in the word Rahmah. The attributes of Jalal can be summarized in the word Adl. These are two attributes of Allah that summarize all of the rest. Now, when it comes to Allah's beatification attributes, Al-Jamal, no one, whether he's a Muslim or whether he's a Christian or a Jew or of another religion, no one will tell you that their ultimate deity and divinity, to us it is Allah, to others it may be Yahweh, or it may be Dios, or it may be someone, however word they may use. No one will argue that Allah is not merciful. No one will argue that Allah is not subtle. No one will argue that Allah is not loving. No one's going to argue with that. That's a given. So the difficulty we're going to have is with Allah's attributes of majesty that have to do with His justice, His qist, social justice. Here is where, because wait a minute here. You mean to tell me Allah is going to hold me accountable in a place that I'm going to be suffering in? I don't think Allah is going to do. I don't think God is going to do something like this. We begin to have a give and take. Arguments begin to develop here around this issue. So this is a dimension of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is absent totally. And because it is totally absent, it necessitates the repetition and the frequent mentioning of it in these certain ayat in the Qur'an, where the mind takes it for granted that Allah, for instance, is not going to destroy a certain society. Why? We don't think that Allah in His everlasting mercy and love and care and affection and compassion, and he's going to destroy a society and a civilization. Millions of people are going to die. The argument is here. Yes, he will. If these people are going to disobey him and continue disobeying him and systematically disobeying him and confrontationally disobeying him, they're going to find out that the result is going to be catastrophic. The climax of it all is going to be total annihilation. That's why we have to emphasize Allah's attributes that center around
power and authority.
His authority and power. And that's been absent in all of these. And I had to bring this.
It's totally absent from most. In fact, I haven't seen that in any of the translations that I've come across. Yours would be. And this takes me, and I think you've kind of articulated and explained it. I want to take something else, which is because we're going to have to wrap up soon. But these are things that we who engage in interfaith debate, have this thrown at us all the time. And this is something else which fascinated me. Surah Nisa, verse 434, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. Men shall take full care of the woman with those bounties that Allah has bestowed upon them. But the important thing here, the verse which actually triggered me here was that the word which you've translated وَضْرِبُهُنَّ. Now, daraba, in fact, I don't think there's every single translation in the world, and missionaries have thrown this out at all the time, that the Qur'an promotes domestic violence. The Qur'an tells you to beat women. Some translators say, tap them lightly, beat them lightly. What is quite fascinating for me is that for the first time, and I've seen this, I've never seen this before, you translate that verses, and as for those women whose condescension you have reason to fear, admonish them first, then leave them alone in bed, then copulate with them. And in your footnote, you've got there, وَإِدْرِبُهُنَّ is not synonymous with وَأَنْكِحُهُنَّ, in that the former refers to sexual intercourse without love, passion, emotions. But here the ayat is referring to an attempt, sexually speaking, between a couple to engage in copulation in order to determine whether they could kickstart some degree of romance or passion. I want to ask this question. I don't have a problem with the translation. I must tell you, I have no problem with it. And I'm probably going to use it in debates in the future. But, what was the exegetical basis, or what was the linguistic justification for this? Because when I look at Lisan al-Arab and even Lane's lexicon, they give alternatives to beat, as, for example, separate or parting. How did you come to this particular translation? This is the only translation in the world. Even Amina Wadud, who, for example, butchers it and translates it else in some other way. But this is the only translation in the world where Surah 4, verse 34, you don't translate daraba as beat, the derivative. You translate it as copulate. What was the basis for that? And how did you come to that? And I'm by no means an Arabic scholar, so I cannot challenge you in any way on that point.
Yeah, it's just simple linguistic investigation. You see, there's a philosophical approach to the Arabic language. It's called one is called the School of Al-Basra, the other is called School of Al-Kufa. The School of Al-Kufa is the one that I sort of belong to, and they consider the past tense to be the origin of because the Arabic language is a derivative language. You derive many words from a source word. So the past tense I consider to be the source word. So you go to the past tense here is daraba. That's the past tense. You go to these dictionaries, and most of the times you're going to find, if not 99.99% of the times, you're going to find the definition of the word along, hit or strike or something like that. And it keeps on going down the road. Now, the word daraba also can have another meaning when it is followed by a preposition. Daraba an, daraba ala, daraba fi, daraba li. So all of these have shades of different meanings. Now, the word, when an animal, in the Arabic language, when an animal, and let me put this in words that everyone can understand. When an animal has sex with another animal, you can't call that nikah. Nikah is when a male and a female come together with the sexual attraction, in addition to mawadda and rahma. This is in another ayah in the Qur'an says, وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. So in addition to the sexual conjoinment of male and female, there is in that conjoinment mawadda, the exchange of love and mercy. In the particular ayah you are looking at, or we are looking at in Surah An-Nisa, there is a frigidity of emotions between male and female, husband and wife. So when that frigidity does away with mawadda and rahma, the sexual act cannot be described as nikah. It has to be described as dirab. Dirab. So right now, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, even though mawadda and rahma is absent, you still come together sexually to probe the depth of your feelings towards each other. You will not be able to understand if you can rejoin in the same affection and love, the share of it that you had, except if you do this. That's the final judgment of whether a marriage can be resumed or not. So that's why the word فَضْرِبُوهُنَّ was used instead of the word فَانْكِحُوهُنَّ. The word nikah would not have worked here because nikah means there is mawadda and rahma between them. But now the mawadda and rahma is absent, so it becomes more or less like animals coming together. It's a mild way, it's an indirect way of saying just have sex to prove to yourselves whether you can rejoin as a husband and wife, or whether that original thrust for attachment is absent and you cannot resume that
spark. In other words, whether that spark can be jump started by copulation. Right. I mean, this is out there. It's something which is fascinating for me, and I hope for the viewers out there. And I'm just being told by my producer that we're going to have to wrap up. But there's so many issues I would like to question you on that, about how the word daraba became beat and assault and so on. But we don't have time. Quickly, another issue, something which is also thrown out by Christian polemicists, the idea of concubinage, Oma malakat aymanuhum. Now, would I be correct that your understanding of Oma malakat aymanuhum, as I see in Surah 4, verse 3 and Surah 25, is that it could be those in your protective care, custody, or those whom you have married and therefore, as Muhammad Asad defines them, rightfully possessed through marriage? Would that be your understanding? That concubinage, as has traditionally been practiced, both by Jews, Christians, and within the Muslim world and within the fiqh legislation, there's no justification for that in the Qur'an, and your phenomenal translation bears it out, and many others as well, that there's no justification for concubinage. Would I be correct?
That's right. You're correct. This is also another intruding concept that made its way into Islamic translation, into Islamic literature and books. That whole word has to be omitted from.
So the justification after the fact, right? So there was a practice that existed in Islamic history, and then they invented or mythologized the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and then attempted to justify and atomize certain passages of the Quran and read their understanding into the text, thereby divorcing the original meaning of it.
You see, ma malakat aymanukum has to be placed in the circumstances that it is meant for. The circumstances that it is meant for is 90+% of it are war circumstances, where there are broken families, where there are families which don't have a breadwinner. There are families that don't have a husband. There are families that don't have fathers. In these circumstances, what are you going to do with these families? We don't have the concept of throwing them into some type of building and then giving them some type of rations from time to time without the affection that goes with family life. The only way that they can have more or less a decent family and psychological satisfaction is to join a family. So these widows will join, of course, join a family doesn't mean they're forced into a family. It's done by their own free volition, will. Consent. Yeah. They want to join the family, they join, and they are co-equals in the family. And this can only be brought about by the husband and the wife agreeing to another family, joining them with equality. The children,
which means sex slavery by extension is totally outlawed. Sex slavery, concubinage, that is totally outlawed.
Rubbish. Rubbish.
Absolute rubbish. And that's some of the strongest points that these polemicists attempt to use some of the secondary Islamic source material to attack Islam. I want to bring this to a conclusion, but before I do that, in your preface you say the particular translation of the meanings of the Quran is by no means exhaustive. It is, though, a step forward in breaking new ground, and I certainly can confirm that it is. I haven't had this much excitement in reading this one here in a long time. You say it is an attempt to bridge the gap that has developed between the theoretical and the practical, the theological and the ideological, the emotional and the mental. In other words, it is a translation that highlights the misunderstood or the disregarded dimensions of this unfailing Quranic text, divine text. I would certainly concur and confirm that. Where could the public, is this available on e-format? It's quite a bulky edition I've got here. I'm proud to say I'm the owner. Where is this book? Where can viewers obtain this particular translation? Is it available on your website, the Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought website? Where could South Africans and indeed members of the public globally obtain such a copy?
Well, I have the addresses here. I don't have them in front of me written as such, but I wish you would have asked that question, earlier on.
Well, what we can do is I would tell the viewers, because I've certainly got a few in my possession. You can share that with me later. If viewers want a copy, they could email me at info@yusufismail.com. It's info@yusufismail, YUSUFISMAIL.com. And I'll certainly give the details once I get them from you, Imam. So viewers can email me. But I believe that I have a few copies available in my possession, but they're just a few. I've got about 4 or 5. I'm willing to offer them at no cost to the non-Muslim public. If there are non-Muslims out there who are listening, who will be listening to this, I'll give them out at no cost to you. And certainly for further information in terms of obtaining them, I will certainly obtain them from Imam Al Asi. And you can email me at info@yusufismail.com, and I'll certainly get the details. Any last final messages to the South African audience? We are living in troublesome times. We are living under the behest of a corrupt government, probably one of the most corrupt in the world. Any final passing thoughts and messages to the South African public, more particularly in relation to how we as Muslims could maintain an interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran and internalize it and make it operational in society?
I think, there's a very promising potential for the whole country of South Africa. It's been through some grueling chapters in history during apartheid and in the aftermath of apartheid. Islam really, if it is presented to the people as it is meant without interference from interest groups and from power centers and etc., I think it will resonate throughout South Africa, whether it's the Muslim population there or the non-Muslim population. Obviously, Allah's message is for everyone. And we do have some brothers in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, who do have extra copies of the exegesis, the tafsir that I've worked on in all of these years, and also the Ascendant Qur'an, the translation that we were just talking about. I hope that, somehow this can reach the bookstores, the libraries, especially those areas in South Africa where Muslims are in contact with non-Muslims, whether it's through interfaith activity or whether through its camaraderie or however way it is. Allah's message should shine through. And I hope and I pray that the community in South Africa can be on the leading edge of an Islamic future that we are actually witnessing in our own time. I have no doubt that the future is an Islamic future, not the way it's defined by Saudi Arabia, not the way it's defined by the CIA and MI6 and Mossad and all of these others who are out there to either implode Islam from within or explode against Islam at the war front. They're working on different levels with different mechanisms. And Allah says, وَيَمْكُرُونَ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. They conspire and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners.
Well, Jazakallah khair, Imam Al Asi. It was, phenomenal listening to you. It's an absolute privilege hearing you and engaging with you and tapping into your wisdom. And inshallah, we hope to have more further engagements with you in the future.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. And that's all we have for this evening, folks. That was Imam Al Asi, all the way from Washington, D.C. He is the author of the Ascendant Qur'an. He's done a 14-volume tafsir written directly in the English language. And this beautiful volume here is the Ascendant Qur'an, an advanced English translation of the meanings of the Qur'an. If you want a copy, email me at info@yusufismail.com, and we'll certainly give you the necessary addresses and the details of where to obtain such copies. As I've stated, I've got about 4 or 5 in my possession. So if you are not a Muslim and are interested in obtaining a copy, write to me, email me, and you will get one at no cost. And it's been a privilege. We reached the end of this particular session. And till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and greetings of peace.